Hello and welcome to On the Trail with Miles James Dean. Today's episode begins where we left off in Lewisburg, West Virginia. But before beginning, let me add this caveat. The story you are about to hear is true. However, the name has been changed to protect the innocent or guilty. So in the last episode, Jim had just picked up Blaze, and I, while still at the gas station in Lewisburg, was unaware that a local man who I will identify as Joshua had been observing Joyce, myself, and Jim moving the horses from one trailer to the other, and the license plates on our vehicles clearly indicated that we were northeasterners. I assumed, as with everyone else with whom I interacted while on the trail, he would be as curious as they, but his approach was slightly different in that he had extended steps away before he reached me his hand, causing me to extend mine, and the silence of his next few steps were broken with the words, "How y'all doing?" And instantly, his dialect transported my memory cells from the present back into the past and set them down smack dab in the 1995 movie Deliverance, and not in a good scene. I am not a man who typically will characterize a person based on the color of their skin or the nationality or the way they dress or their political ideology. But the only other time in my life that I could recall hearing an accent so linguistically unique was in that movie. And I was certain that I was talking with a man who was, for my lack of better terminology, a hillbilly. And the men who portrayed the characters of hill people in the 1995 movie Deliverance were not just hillbillies, they were dangerous hillbillies. That image hunkered down in my brain for a few moments, but the longer we stood and talked, the more I began to disassociate him with the character of the hillbillies in the movie Deliverance and began associating him with the television sitcom The Beverly Hillbillies. Those hillbillies, Jed Clampett and his family, although had struck oil and were now rich, were still as country or hillbillyish as can be, and they were friendly. It was that association that allowed me to throw caution to the wind and accept his invitation to spend the night at his place where the horses could be turned out in the corral. Joyce from California, on the other hand, had unanswered questions, and like Bob Dylan, the answers to her questions were still blowing in the wind. She was not convinced that this was a good idea. Soon, I began to question the wisdom in my decision, but for a different reason. The hills we were climbing to get to his home were as steep as the hills, as the hills we went into the valley to avoid, and the needle of the temperature gauge kept climbing along with us. It was close to 7 p.m. when we arrived, and he introduced us to his wife and their 15-year-old daughter. But that still didn't convince Joyce, and she refused to stay in the house. Now, remember, I had just given up Blaze and needed another horse. So after Joyce witnessed that I was still alive, joined us for breakfast in the morning, and Joshua offered to help me find a horse. He said that there were plenty of horses for sale in the area, and if I could stay another day, he was sure that he would find me one. So I agreed. That day was spent going to a few different barns inquiring about a horse for sale, but nothing materialized. I agreed to stay another day, and we went to more barns. And I also helped him move his cattle from one pasture to another and visit with some friends of his. And he talked about how he was helping me, and we just had a good old time, but still no horse. There was an auction that weekend, and Joshua believed that if I could just wait until the weekend, he was sure that he could find me a horse at the auction. By then, even Joyce had chilled and became friendly with the ladies of the house. On Saturday morning before the auction, we sat at the kitchen table, Joshua and I, across from each other. Because Joshua decided to call someone that, although he did not particularly like the person, knew he had horses. In fact, before he called the man, he commented to his wife, who was sitting at the table counter with his daughter and Joyce, that he really didn't want to talk with the man because he had promised to find me a horse, he was going to give him a call, and he did. As I sat across from Joshua, I could tell he wasn't happy with the way the conversation was going because he wasn't saying much, just listening. And I could read in his face that he wasn't pleased. The conversation ended, and as if in a daze and still processing the conversation, Joshua said, "I knew I shouldn't have called him. I just knew it. He talked to me like I was some kind of nigger." And with that, you could hear a pin drop. It was quieter than a church mouse who wasn't even thinking about pissing on cotton, until you heard his daughter whisper, "Mommy, did you hear what Daddy said?" Joshua was now looking at me, and I watched his eyes begin to water, and I knew what he was thinking. I knew he was hurt and ashamed, and I knew why. You see, in the short time that we were together, he had become to learn the same thing that I had learned, which was, you can never judge a man until you've walked a mile in his gym shoes. My time spent with Joshua had totally changed my perception of a hillbilly and my perspective on people living in rural America, as had the time he spent with me changed his perception of the word nigger and perspective on Black America. It was a transformative moment for him, and I understood it because I had gone through it also. I wasn't going to permit him to shed not a tear, so I broke the tension by saying, "Well, it looks like we are going to the auction after all, my friend." And with that, we headed out. There were several good-looking horses for sale at the auction, and a 4-year-old Pinto caught my eye. He was white with brown markings or patches and stood about 14 hands or 58 inches tall, measuring from the ground up to his withers. And his name was Dooley. I planned to leave that Monday, allowing a couple of days for Sankofa and Dooley to hang out together and get acquainted. That Sunday, Joshua and I went out to his shed and began to do some horse trading. We weren't trading horses, of course, but the expression is commonly used to refer to the negotiations and bargaining in items bought and sold. While horse trading was the expression I commonly was used to hearing, Joshua, on the other hand, called it dickering. It was on the second day at his home when he first mentioned the word dickering, and I had no idea what he was talking about. But with that heavy accent of his, it took me a while to figure out most of the words he was saying, and some I would just let go by, and dickering was one of them. So when he said, "Okay, let's go out to the barn and do some dickering," was when I finally asked him, what was dickering? So after about an hour of dickering, I had 2 bridles and a set of matching reins. I had nothing to dicker with except money, but I enjoyed the back and forth. We left early on Monday and drove back down the mountain and back to the same gas station where we had left 4 days ago, and from there, I began my ride toward Charleston, a little more than 100 miles away. It was on the second day of the ride that I decided to try out my newly acquired horse, and what a surprise. He had the most beautiful lope I had ever ridden. I mean, it was like nothing I had ever experienced. It was smoother than Sankofa's, smoother than Blaze's lope had become, and a sheer joy to ride on him. It was also the first time I had ever ridden on a horse whose lope nearly put me to sleep. Yes, he was loping in slow motion. I wasn't getting anywhere, going 1 mile an hour. Well, it was clear that Dooley had been trained to be a Western pleasure riding horse. Now, what is a Western pleasure riding horse? Well, it's a Western style of riding where a horse demonstrates his disciplined abilities to walk or trot or lope in slow, collected gaits. Here, let me show you something. Now, I was trying to make it to California in February of 2008, not 2009. And if you think this was bad in terms of what I needed to get out of him, it gets even worse. Between he and Sankofa, it took me 4 days to arrive in Charleston, where we were met by a young brother whose name I can't remember, but it was a good brother, and who allowed us to park our trailer and stable our horses where he had his. He was a very friendly young man, and I was grateful for his hospitality. Ironically, he was also the first black man that I had seen in over 3 weeks. It took me 3 more days to get from Charleston, West Virginia, to cross the border and ride into Canonsburg, Kentucky, where we were allowed to pitch our corral and camp out for the night on the property of a hotel, I believe Days Inn or something like that. I really can't remember. We arrived early in the afternoon with plenty of time to prepare for the night, and it is when the unthinkable happened. I tied Sankofa to the side of the trailer, brought Dooley out and tied him to the other side of the trailer, took out the portable corral, set it up, and put the horses inside the corral. I stood back admiring the view of the horses and the beautiful mountains in the background, and then watched in awe as Dooley jumped over my portable corral, and even more startled when Sankofa jumped right behind him, and off they went into the beautiful Appalachian Mountains. For a moment I stood there, stunned and in disbelief, watching them flying up the path and disappearing. I was out there for at least 15 minutes calling their names and hoping to hear a whinny or the rustling of leaves, but no, they were gone. I don't know for how long and how far you would have been out there, in the home of coyotes and raccoons and porcupines and timber rattlesnakes and black bear, but 15 minutes was enough for me, and I headed back to the camp. As I began walking back to the camp, re-envisioning what I had just witnessed, it dawned on me why I was able to acquire Sankofa in the first place. Those of you who watched episode 2 may remember that I mentioned Sankofa's original owner sold him to me because at the age of 4 months, he wouldn't stop jumping over the 4-foot fence that corralled him. This was deja vu in real time. Now, normally when horses run away, if they have any intention of coming back, it would be around feeding time. And so even though it was still early, I prepared the evening feed. A good 45 minutes had passed when I started walking up the path that led into the woods, shaking the bucket half full of grain as I had done, if you recall, in the home in Mill Gap, hoping that the sound would carry far enough into the woods and that they were hungry. Well, by the spirit of their ancestors, sure enough, those horses found their way back to the bucket, and I took 10 sighs of relief. 2 things now had become obvious. 1, that brought a halt to using the portable corral, which meant that the horses would either need to be tied up if staying outside overnight, or kept in the trailer. And of course, that depended upon where we kept. And second, having added insult to injury, it was apparent that Dooley had to go quicker than anticipated. Ladies and gentlemen, the hunt was now on for another horse. I'm going to leave it there. And in the next episode, we'll pick it up with The Horse from Hell. As always, like the video if you like it. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. And in the famous words of Roy, happy trails to you until we meet again.